The rain had been a constant companion since the fire, not the gentle, cleansing kind, but a cold, insistent drizzle that mirrored the ache in my chest. Every morning I woke to its drumming against the window of my rented apartment, a sound that no longer soothed but merely underscored the unending gray. I used to love the rain. Now it was just another reminder of everything I'd lost, everything I'd built, everything I'd destroyed. My name is Raj, or it was. Sometimes it felt like a name for someone else, someone lighter, someone who didn't carry the weight of ash and regret in every breath. I'd been an architect, a creator of spaces, a designer of homes. Now the irony was a bitter taste. I, who had shaped dreams into blueprints, had seen my own family's dream, our dream, consumed by the very walls I'd conceived. My wife, my children, gone in the house I'd designed. Every beam, every joist, every carefully planned exit route had failed them. Someone had failed me. The guilt was a living thing inside me, a parasite burrowing deeper with each passing day. It spoke in whispers when I was alone, screamed in silence when I tried to sleep. It showed me images, the flickering orange glow, the desperate, unheard cries, and sometimes in the dead of night, it showed me the infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves. It was a place of sterile white walls and a singular, unblinking presence, a place where time itself had died, and the burden of existence simply was. I didn't know who the patient was or why they never left, only that the image was burned into my mind, a symbol of unending confinement and agony. My days were a blur of routine, a desperate attempt to impose order on a life that had shattered into a million irreparable pieces. I'd walked the same route to the small, anonymous office I'd found, a place where I could draft structural calculations for anonymous buildings, far from the grand visions I once chased. The smell of stale coffee and old paper was my perfume, the drone of a distant city my symphony. My colleagues, a polite, distant presence, never asked about my past. They knew enough, I suppose. The haunted look in my eyes, the tremor in my hands when I gripped a pencil too hard, the way I flinched at sudden noises. They understood that some wounds were too deep for polite conversation. I slept alone, in a bed that felt vast and empty. I would often sit by the window, watching the rain, watching the world move on, while I remained stuck, a fly in amber, forever preserved in the moment of that devastating loss. My determination, once a driving force, had morphed into a grim resolve to simply exist, to endure the punishment of living. Then came the letter. It arrived on a Tuesday, tucked between a utility bill and junk mail. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, bearing an unfamiliar wax seal. My fingers fumbled with it, a rare tremor of something other than grief stirring within me. Inside, a formal letter from a solicitor I'd never heard of, informing me of an unexpected inheritance. My great-aunt, a distant relative I barely remembered, had passed away. She'd left me everything. And by everything, the solicitor's words implied. They meant the ancestral home, a sprawling, dilapidated estate tucked away in a forgotten corner of the countryside, miles from anywhere. The Croft, the letter called it. The name sounded old, heavy like a tome bound in crumbling leather. I reread the letter several times, the words blurring, then sharpening. An ancestral home. The phrase echoed in my mind, a strange counterpoint to the raw wound of my own recent tragedy. My father, a quiet man, had rarely spoken of his past, certainly never of a grand ancestral home. It was as if that entire branch of our lineage had simply faded or been deliberately erased. A knock on my apartment door startled me. I hadn't expected anyone, the solicitor. He hadn't waited for my reply to his letter. Mr. Raj. His voice was thin, reedy, like dry leaves skittering across pavement. His eyes, though, were sharp, assessing, and held a peculiar glint of something. Expectation, pity, I couldn't tell. I opened the door, a knot tightening in my stomach. He explained the details, the legalities, the surprising clause in my great-aunt's will that specifically named me as the sole inheritor. He spoke of the house's remote location, its age, its peculiarities. It's been empty for a very long time, Mr. Raj, the solicitor said, his gaze lingering on my face. Decades, in fact, my great-aunt was particular about it. Preferred it unoccupied, I understand, said it needed to rest. He paused, a strange half-smile playing on his lips. A very old house, it has a presence. My chest tightened, a presence. The word hung in the air thick with unspoken meaning. My mind, still raw from the fire, recoiled. Another house, another set of walls, Another place where things could go wrong, where life could be extinguished. Why me? Why now? A faint, almost imperceptible curiosity. A desperate need for change. Anything to break the crushing monotony of my grief. The infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves. Perhaps this dilapidated, ancient house could offer an escape. Or perhaps it was simply another form of confinement. Another kind of patient never leaving. The solicitor watched me, his expression unreadable. It requires a great deal of work, of course, structural integrity. There are stories. He didn't elaborate. He just let the words hang, heavy and ominous. A place where echoes of the past might linger. A place where I might finally confront something other than my own reflection in the rain-streaked window. A place where perhaps I could finally break free from the perpetual suffering I carried, or a place where I would finally succumb to it. I'll go, I heard myself say, the words foreign even to my own ears. A decision made not out of hope, but out of a desperate, suicidal impulse for anything different. The solicitor's smile widened, a little too much, a little too quickly. What exactly was I walking into? The weight of the old house pressed in on me the moment I stepped from the hired car, not the physical weight of its stone and timber, but a presence, a stillness that felt like held breath. The detective's words from weeks ago echoed, an unwelcome guest, a presence. My chest tightened just as it had then. I pushed the thought away, along with the memory of the acrid smoke and the frantic, futile shouts. This was different. This had to be. The ancestral home, a sprawling Victorian behemoth, loomed against the bruised twilight sky. Gables like accusing fingers, windows like vacant eyes. It was larger than I remembered from the brief, numb visit after the reading of the will. The air here was heavy with the scent of damp earth and decay, a stark contrast to the sterile, scorched smell that still clung to the edges of my memory. I gripped the steering wheel, gripped tight. Determination, a brittle shield, was all I had left. I wouldn't let another house break me. The movers had left the boxes haphazardly in the cavernous foyer, a mountain range of cardboard in the dim light. Each box was a monument to a life I was trying to rebuild, a life I felt I no longer deserved. I chose a large, unmarked one, its contents a mystery even to me. My hands, still calloused from the demolition work I'd thrown myself into, found purchase on the rough edges. I dragged it towards the grand, curving staircase, the wood groaning in protest under the box's weight and my own. Every sound in this house was amplified, swallowed, then spat back out. The creak of a floorboard above, the whisper of wind through a loose pane, the gentle thump of my own footfalls, each seemed to carry an unnerving significance. I decided my bedroom would be the first sanctuary, a room on the second floor, overlooking a neglected garden. The wallpaper was a faded floral pattern, peeling in strips like sunburnt skin. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light filtering through the grimy windows. I tore open the box, revealing a jumble of clothes, a few books, and a small framed photograph. My fingers trembled as I picked it up. Their faces smiling. I quickly tucked it away, face down. In a drawer, not now. I couldn't afford distractions. Hours bled into a dull ache in my shoulders. I unpacked methodically, hanging shirts in the antique wardrobe, arranging books on a rickety shelf. The silence in the house was profound, broken only by the occasional distant groan of the old structure settling. Or was it settling? A floorboard directly above my head gave a sharp, singular crack. I froze, listening. Nothing. Just the wind, I told myself, rattling the eaves. The house was old. It breathed. But the sound had been too distinct, too isolated. My scalp prickled. The meager electricity I'd managed to get connected only illuminated small pockets, leaving vast stretches of the ancestral home in an inky blackness. I needed to explore, to understand its layout, to find the fuse box, perhaps even a broom. I grabbed a powerful flashlight, its beam cutting a stark path through the gloom. I wandered through hallways lined with portraits of stern-faced ancestors, their eyes seeming to follow my progress. My breath plumed in front of me. The floorboards here were slick with a fine layer of dust, undisturbed for decades. I passed what looked like a disused study, then a pantry with shelves still laden with ancient, petrified jars. The flashlight beam danced, revealing cobwebs thick as shrouds. Then I found it, a door unlike any other. Plain, unadorned, set into a wall that otherwise held only more faded wallpaper. A strange, metallic tang, like old blood and disinfectant, wafted from within. Every instinct screamed at me to turn back, but a morbid curiosity, A need to know every hidden corner of this place I now owned compelled me forward. I pushed the door open. White-tiled walls, yellowed with age, gleamed faintly. A narrow, cot-like bed stood against one wall, its mattress a thin, lumpy thing covered in a stained, moth-eaten blanket. A single, rickety wooden chair sat beside it. On a small, chipped enamel table, a few rusted instruments lay scattered: a dull pair of scissors, a broken thermometer, a small, empty glass vial. This was an infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves. A profound sense of desolation clung to everything. I shone the light on the bed again. Not just a temporary impression, but a permanent, weary imprint in the fabric. A faint, almost imperceptible groan seemed to emanate from the mattress itself, a low, drawn-out sound that vibrated in the soles of my feet. My heart lurched. My breath caught in my throat. I stood frozen, the beam of my flashlight trembling in my suddenly unsteady hand. The groan intensified, a low, guttural rumble that seemed to fill the small room. It was not the house settling. It was something else. What was it? Just as it had when the detective spoke of a presence weeks ago. That familiar constriction, like a cold hand squeezing my lungs, returned with a vengeance the moment my feet touched the cracked flagstones of the porch. The air itself felt heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faint, like old pennies left too long in the rain. I told myself it was just the house, centuries of trapped air, the decay of forgotten things. This was my fresh start. Wasn't it? A place to bury the grief, to escape the crushing weight of the fire, the architectural plans I'd drawn, the blueprints of my own damnation. I pushed open the heavy oak door. It groaned, a mournful sound that echoed through the cavernous foyer, bouncing off walls too high, too wide. Dust motes danced in the slivers of light that pierced the grimy windows, illuminated like tiny, frantic spirits. My breath plumed in the cold air, even though it was a mild evening outside. I moved slowly, each step a deliberate act of defiance against the oppressive stillness. The silence wasn't empty, it was full, brimming with unspoken things, with the weight of generations. That first night I tried to impose order. I unpacked boxes, dragged furniture, anything to make the space my own. I heard sounds, of course. Old houses breathe. The creak of settling timber, the groan of pipes, the wind whistling through the eaves. I rationalized each one. Just the house. It's old, my imagination. But there was a persistent, subtle scratching from somewhere above, a sound like dry claws on plaster that didn't quite fit the narrative of an aging structure. I'd freeze listening, my shoulders hunched, until the silence stretched too long and I'd force myself to move again. Days bled into a week. The scratching grew bolder, shifting from the attic to the floor directly above my bedroom. Sometimes it sounded like something dragging, a heavy, uneven thud followed by a soft, insistent scrape. I'd lie awake, staring at the ceiling, my heart thrumming against my ribs, willing it to stop. One morning I found a thin trail of dust, almost imperceptible, leading from the attic access panel in the hallway down the stairs, ending abruptly at the kitchen door. Had I tracked it in? No. It was too fine, too precise. I wiped it away, my fingers trembling, and tried to forget it. I spent my days sketching, trying to recapture the spark that had once defined me, but the house seeped into my work. One afternoon, while engrossed in a particularly grim drawing of a collapsing archway, I heard it clearly, a low, resonant hum vibrating through the floorboards beneath my feet. It wasn't mechanical, it felt organic, like a vast, unseen engine purring deep within the earth. I froze, my pencil clattering to the desk. The hum intensified, a deep, unsettling thrum that seemed to resonate in my very bones, making my teeth ache. I told myself it was a vibration from a distant road, or maybe the old well pump, though I hadn't even found a well. I needed to explore, to understand this place, to demystify it. The fear was irrational. It was grief playing tricks on my mind. I was a man of logic, an architect. I dealt in tangible structures, not phantoms. That night, unable to sleep, the hum still a phantom echo in my ears, I decided to do what I had been avoiding, explore the forgotten wings of the house. I grabbed a lantern, the wiring in some sections was ancient, unreliable, and began. I passed through dusty ballrooms, empty libraries, rooms filled with shrouded furniture that looked like sleeping giants. The metallic smell intensified, mingled now with something else, something sickly sweet and cloying, like decaying flowers. I found it off a long, narrow corridor. At the very back of the house, beyond a set of heavy, unmarked double doors that were slightly ajar. I pushed the doors open slowly. The room was unlike any other in the house. It was small, stark, with whitewashed walls that seemed to absorb all sound. There were shelves lined with tarnished instruments, glass vials, and faded, leather-bound books. A single, rickety wooden bed stood in the center, and on it, perfectly still, lay a figure. This was the infirmary at night. One patient who never leaves. The air in the room was thick, heavy, like breathing underwater. The greenish glow came from a tall, cylindrical jar on a nearby table, filled with a cloudy, viscous liquid that pulsed with a faint, internal light. My gaze was fixed on the bed. The figure was covered by a thin, gray sheet pulled up to its chin. I couldn't discern any features, just the distinct outline of a head, shoulders, and the gentle rise of a chest. It was unnervingly still. Not a breath stirred the sheet, not a muscle twitched. It was too still. My hands grew clammy, the lantern shaking. Who was this? Why were they here? And why did the room feel like a mausoleum, yet also vibrate with an almost imperceptible, malevolent energy that seemed to emanate directly from the shrouded figure on the bed? Was it breathing? I strained my eyes, trying to catch the slightest movement, the tiniest ripple of fabric. Nothing. My mind screamed at me to run. But my feet were rooted to the spot, held captive by a morbid fascination. The hum, the one I'd felt earlier, returned, a low, deep thrumming that seemed to rise from the very floor beneath me. This time, it wasn't just in my bones. It felt like it was coming from the figure on the bed. My head swam. Was this real? Was I finally losing my mind, my grief twisting reality into these grotesque shapes? Or was something truly waiting, perfectly still? In the infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves, and something else. Something ancient and metallic, like stagnant blood mixed with rust. It clung to my clothes, to my hair, even as I stepped inside, the heavy oak door groaning shut behind me. The silence that followed was not empty. It vibrated with an oppressive weight, a held breath. I had to find an explanation. I had to. My architectural training, my entire career, was built on logic, on structure, on understanding how things fit together. This house, with its whispering shadows and the chill that seeped into my bones, was a problem to be solved, a flawed design to be corrected. There had to be a rational answer for the flickering lights, the sudden drops in temperature, the pervasive sense of being watched. Grief could play tricks, I knew that. Guilt could twist perception until reality fractured. But this felt different, too tangible. I spent the next few days in a methodical, almost obsessive, exploration. I started with the ground floor, moving from room to room with a flashlight and a notepad, even in broad daylight. I mapped the layout, sketching walls and windows, noting every creak in the floorboards, every draft. The house was a labyrinth of forgotten spaces. Dust motes danced in the sparse light that pierced the grime-coated windows, illuminating an almost geological layering of neglect. The air tasted of plaster and decaying wood, sickly sweet dampness that never quite dissipated. I ran my fingers over the peeling wallpaper, feeling for seams that didn't quite match, for faint outlines of doors long since plastered over. I checked the fireplaces, the chimneys, the foundations. There were anomalies, of course. Walls that seemed too thick, sections of floor that felt strangely unsupported beneath my weight, despite the solid joists I'd glimpsed in the cellar. But nothing overtly supernatural. Just the slow, creeping decay of a structure left to its own devices. I heard things, the drag of something heavy across the floorboards above me when I knew the upper levels were empty. A low, guttural sigh that seemed to emanate from the very walls. Was it the wind, the settling of old timber, or was it the house itself, breathing around me? One evening, deep into my investigation of the main parlor, I noticed it. A small, almost imperceptible discoloration on the ceiling, directly above a sturdy, built-in bookshelf. It wasn't water damage nor mold. It was a subtle patch, a slight variation in the aged plaster, a difference in texture that only an architect's eye, trained to spot the minutiae of construction, would catch. It suggested a patch job, a repair, but one executed with a skill meant to conceal rather than merely fix. And it didn't quite align with the joists I knew ran above. My gaze traveled down the wall, from the suspicious patch to the heavy bookshelf. It was an old piece built into an alcove filled with leather-bound volumes, their spines cracked and faded. I ran my hand along the thick oak frame, solid, too solid. The wall behind it felt different too, not the usual cool, slightly rough plaster. This felt dense like stone, but the house was brick and timber, a flicker of unease, then a surge of determination. This was it, a hidden space, a logical explanation for the odd structural inconsistencies. I spent an hour emptying the shelves, setting aside the dusty books, treatises on forgotten botanicals, grim collections of poetry, ledgers filled with neat, spidery script. The scent of old paper and dust motes filled the air, tickling my nose. Behind the last book, on the very bottom shelf, the wall seemed to recede slightly. I pressed against it. Nothing. I pushed harder, feeling for a seam, a latch. My fingers brushed against a faint indentation, a barely there seam in the wood paneling that formed the back of the shelf. It wasn't a hinge, not exactly, more like a pressure point. I pushed again, this time with more force, and heard a soft, almost inaudible click. The entire bookshelf, with a low groan of ancient hinges, swung inward, not the damp earth or rust, but something sharper, something medicinal and cloying, like dried herbs and old linen. My flashlight beam cut through the absolute blackness beyond, revealing a narrow, dust-choked corridor. The air in there was still heavy, as if it hadn't moved in decades. I stepped through the opening, the bookshelf swinging back slightly, creating a claustrophobic tunnel. The corridor was short, leading to a single heavy wooden door, unmarked and unadorned. My breath hitched. I reached for the doorknob. My hand trembled slightly as I turned it. It didn't resist. I flicked on my flashlight, the beam cutting a harsh swath through the gloom. The walls were painted a faded, sickly green. A single high window boarded up from the outside cast no light. In the center, dominating the space, was a narrow, iron-framed bed, and on that bed, perfectly still, was a form. This was the infirmary, at night, and there was one patient. My flashlight beam found them. They lay on their back, covered by a thin, stained sheet pulled up to their chin. What I could see of their face was a ruin of desiccated skin, stretched taut over bone. The body beneath the sheet seemed unnaturally flat, almost two-dimensional. It was clearly human or had been, but the condition, it wasn't a skeleton. It wasn't a mummy, not exactly. It was something in between, preserved by the dry, cold air, yet utterly shriveled. A choked gasp escaped my throat. I stumbled back, my heel catching on the threshold of the hidden door. The flashlight beam wavered, dancing across the silent, unmoving figure. They had been here a long time. Decades, perhaps, and they had never left. Who was this? What happened in this room? Why was it sealed away? The metallic tang, that ancient, stagnant blood and rust smell, clung to me, thick and cloying. It was in my nostrils, on my tongue, seeping into the very fabric of my clothes. The heavy oak door had groaned shut, a sound like a dying sigh, and then the silence. Not an empty silence, but a weighted one, a held breath that pressed in on my eardrums, making them ache. I had to move. I had to find a source, a reason for this pervasive, suffocating quiet. My fingers, still gritty from the exterior, curled into fists. I pushed deeper into the ground floor, my footsteps muffled by the thick dust and what felt like layers of forgotten sorrow. It tasted like old wood and decaying fabric, but also like something sharper, a faint, acrid note that prickled the back of my throat. I found it off a narrow, forgotten corridor, tucked away behind a pantry filled with desiccated jars and cobwebbed shelves. A door not quite like the others. It was painted a faded, sickly green and had a small, tarnished brass plaque where the knob should have been. The plaque read in elegant, almost illegible script, "Infirmary." My breath hitched. The previous chapters of the ledger had hinted at illnesses, long, drawn-out affairs, but nothing like this. Why would an ancestral home have a dedicated infirmary? It didn't groan or squeal, but opened with a soft, almost reverent sigh, revealing the space beyond. It was an infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves. The single window, high and narrow, let in only a sliver of the moon's weak light, painting the room in shades of charcoal and silver. The metallic smell intensified, laced with something else now, a faint, sweet decay. Like forgotten flowers on a gravesite. There was a cot stripped bare, its metal frame rusted and scarred. A single threadbare blanket lay folded meticulously at the foot, as if waiting. On a small, rickety bedside table, an empty glass vial lay on its side, reflecting the moonlight like a teardrop. Next to it, a small, leather-bound journal. I picked up the journal, my fingers trembling slightly. The leather was brittle, the pages yellowed and thin. It wasn't a doctor's log, I realized, but a diary. The handwriting was delicate, almost spidery, and the ink faded. I flipped through the pages, the rustle a loud invasion in the stillness. It spoke of a young woman, Alina, confined to this room, wasting away. My sorrow is its sustenance, my guilt its feast. Guilt? What guilt could a young woman confined to an infirmary possess? Another page later, more desperate. He visits at night, not the groundskeeper nor the mistress. Another, a presence. The child she lost, her grief, her guilt. The words blurred on the page, but their meaning solidified into a horrifying clarity. I remembered the architect's sketches, the strange organic patterns hidden within the house's structure. I remembered my family, their faces, the smoke, the heat, the crushing weight of my own guilt, the design flaws, the fire that had consumed everything. The entity fed on grief. It fed on guilt. I dropped the journal. It hit the floor with a soft thud, a sound that seemed to shake the very foundations of the room. This was not just a house haunted by echoes. It was a predator, a parasitic organism that sought out anguish, cultivated it, and consumed it. Alina, the patient who never left, had been one of its victims. And I, Raj, steeped in the bitter sediment of my own catastrophic loss, my own unbearable culpability, was the perfect host. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the corner of the room, like brittle bones snapping. Nothing, it wasn't just the smell of the house anymore. It was the smell of it. A low, almost imperceptible hum started, vibrating through the floorboards, up into my feet, a deep, resonant thrum that felt like it was coming from inside my own skull. Was it just the house settling, or was it something else, something stirring in response to my terrifying realization? The words from the journal still burned behind my eyes. The child she lost, her grief, her guilt. The architect's sketches, the organic lines woven into the very bones of this house, they weren't just decorative. They were veins, conduits, and my family, their faces, the smoke. It wasn't just a memory anymore. It was a blueprint, a horrifying, inescapable pattern. The house fed on grief, on guilt. And I, Raj, was a brimming reservoir. A cold dread seeped into my bones, a chill deeper than any draft. This wasn't a place of solace. This was a cage, meticulously crafted. I had to leave. Now, every fiber of my being screamed for escape. The quiet, analytical part of me, the architect, was drowned out by a primal, desperate urge to flee. I shoved the journal back into the chest, not bothering to close it properly, and lunged for the study door. The hallway was a tunnel of shifting shadows. My footsteps, usually muted on the thick rugs, echoed with a frantic urgency. The air grew heavy, pressing against my lungs. Tasting metallic and stale, like pennies left in the rain, I ignored it. I had to get out. The grand front door, a heavy slab of oak and iron, loomed ahead. It was my only way, the most direct path to the outside world, to safety. I reached for the brass knob. My fingers wrapped around it, the metal biting into my skin. I twisted. It didn't budge. I tried again, putting my full weight into it, gritting my teeth. The knob remained stubbornly fixed. My breath hitched. I slammed my shoulder against the door. The ancient wood groaned, but held firm. It wasn't just stuck, it was sealed. I pivoted, scanning the hall for another exit. A side door tucked away near the disused servant's entrance. Hope, a fragile, desperate thing, flickered. I ran, my heart thumping a frantic rhythm against my ribs. The floorboards beneath my feet began to hum, a low, resonant vibration that I felt more in my teeth than my ears. It wasn't a structural vibration, it was something else, something alive. The side door was smaller, less imposing. I fumbled with the latch, my fingers clumsy with adrenaline. It was stiff, coated in a thick layer of rust. I yanked. It wouldn't open. It seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. My gaze darted to the large bay window in the drawing room. Glass, breakable, my only option. I swung it, putting all my fear and desperation into the blow. The paperweight connected with a dull thud. The glass didn't shatter, it didn't even crack. The glass felt like solid rock. A wave of nausea washed over me. This wasn't just an old house with faulty mechanisms. This was deliberate. The house was alive. It was holding me. I backed away from the window, my eyes darting around the room. The air grew thick, suffocating, laden with an invisible weight. I felt pressure on my chest, like a silent hand pressing down, making each breath a conscious struggle. There had to be another way. I remembered a forgotten corner of the house, a narrow corridor I'd seen on an old blueprint, leading to what was simply labeled service rooms in faded script. It was a long shot, but I was out of options. The corridor was cramped, the ceiling low, pressing down on me, something metallic and old, like the lingering scent of forgotten blood. My skin prickled. At the end of the passage, a door, unadorned and unassuming, stood ajar. I pushed it open, the hinges groaning in protest. I found myself in the infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves. The room was small, stark. The air was frigid, biting, and heavy with a palpable sense of abandonment and sorrow. A single narrow cot, its metal frame rusted, stood against one wall. A thin, faded blanket was draped over it, barely covering the form beneath. The outline was small, impossibly small. A child. The patient was utterly still, an unnatural stillness that screamed of absence, of finality. A single, ancient wooden chair stood beside the cot, as if someone had just risen from it, leaving behind an unbearable vigil. Dust motes danced in the sliver of moonlight filtering through a grimy window, swirling like lost souls. It wasn't my own grief, not precisely, but an echo, a memory of an anguish so deep it had permeated the very fabric of the room. This was where the entity had feasted before. This was a monument to its cruel appetite. My throat was dry, my mouth tasting of ash. I could almost hear the faint, desperate whimpers that must have once filled this room. I wanted to scream, to run, to tear my way out of this house. As I reached the doorframe, a soft thud echoed behind me, not a bang but a deliberate, almost gentle sound. I spun around. The door, which I had left ajar, was now closed. Completely. I lunged for the knob, twisting it with desperate force. Locked. The ancient wood felt solid, unyielding. There was no key, there was no way out. Mine. It was a possessive sound, ancient and absolute. I was trapped, truly trapped. The house was not just an old building, it was a living, breathing predator, and I was its prey. What did it want from me now that it had me completely? Her grief. It wasn't just a me. I gripped the brittle pages, the paper flaking against my fingertips. My breath hitched in my throat, a ragged, dry sound in the vast silence of the library. My family's fire, the fire that took everything, the one I had designed. It wasn't an accident, not entirely. The architect's notes, cryptic as they were, hinted at a deeper purpose, a cycle, a feeding. I spent the rest of the night hunched over the journal, my eyes straining in the dim glow of my lantern. The old ink bled into the parchment, blurring the lines of the architect's sprawling hand. He wrote of sorrow, of shadows that clung to the family name like a shroud. He wrote of the hunger, a ceaseless craving that demanded sustenance. He detailed how the house itself was a living trap, its very structure designed to channel, to contain, to offer. And then, a series of entries, increasingly frantic, about a specific room, a place of quiet suffering, a place where the patient resided, tended to, yet never truly healed. The room he described, the infirmary, I'd never seen it. This house was a labyrinth, full of forgotten corners and sealed-off wings. The journal gave vague directions, references to a hidden passage behind a particular tapestry, a narrow stairwell leading down, not into the cellars I knew, but deeper, into the earth itself, it seemed. I had to know. I moved through the echoing halls, the air growing heavier with each step, thick with the scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and faintly sweet, like forgotten blood. I found the tapestry, a faded depiction of a hunting scene, behind it, a barely visible seam in the stone. It groaned open, revealing a shaft of inky blackness. The air that rushed out was stale, frigid, carrying the deep, earthy smell of ancient decay. A narrow, spiral staircase, carved from rough-hewn stone, corkscrewed downwards, the steps uneven and slick with moisture. Each creak under my weight was amplified, echoing back at me, a ghostly whisper in the dark. At the bottom, a heavy wooden door, bound with rusted iron straps, stood sentinel, no handle, only a single large iron bolt, thick as my wrist, which slid back with a grating shriek that tore through the stillness. I pushed the door open, the sound of tearing wood on stone sending shivers down my spine. I stepped into what the journal called the infirmary at night. One patient who never leaves. The room was small, circular, carved directly into the bedrock, the walls weeping moisture. In the center, on a crudely fashioned stone slab, lay a figure. It was skeletal, wrapped in what looked like desiccated, leathery skin stretched taut over bone. It wasn't a mummy in the conventional sense. It was something preserved by the very air of this place, or perhaps by whatever force dwelled here. The eye sockets were empty, yet they seemed to stare, fixed on the low, vaulted ceiling. Its mouth was a gaping maw, as if caught in a silent scream. And around its neck, a tarnished silver locket, identical to the one I'd found in my grandmother's belongings. My flashlight beam trembled, dancing across the ancient horror. The patient, this was it, not alive, not dead, but something else, sustained. The room itself felt like a heartbeat, slow and heavy. These were older still, their pages brittle, their script almost indecipherable. But one phrase, scrawled in a different, more recent hand, jumped out at me from an open page. The architect built the cage, we fed the beast, the bloodline is the key. My gaze snapped back to the skeletal figure. This wasn't just a patient, this was the patient, a vessel, a conduit. They hadn't just endured the presence, they had cultivated it, they had fed it. The architect's designs, the organic lines, they weren't just for channeling. They were for collecting, for harvesting. The air grew heavy, pressing in on me, stealing my breath. The metallic scent intensified, cloying and sweet. My head swam. I saw flashes, my family's faces distorted by smoke and fear, the roaring flames, the collapse of the house I had designed. My guilt. It was a beacon. It was a feast. The journal entries, the architect's sketches, the skeletal patient on the slab, the locket, it all clicked into place with a sickening finality. This malevolent force, this entity, wasn't just in the house. It was the house, nurtured by my bloodline, thriving on the sorrow and misdeeds of generations. And I, with my profound, suffocating guilt over the fire, with the legacy of my family's complicity running in my veins, I wasn't just an inheritor. I was the next offering, the chosen sacrifice. This wasn't just a ghost story. This was my family's legacy, a horrifying inheritance passed down through generations. And now it was my turn. What did they want from me? My breath hitched, ragged and thin in the cold, still air of the infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves. My eyes, raw and stinging, traced the outline of the skeletal figure on the cart. It wasn't a corpse. It wasn't alive in any way I understood. It was a vessel, a receptacle, a thing fashioned by generations of my family, nourished by their deepest regrets. The truth clawed at my throat, threatening to choke me. They hadn't just lived with this horror, they had built it. A wave of nausea rolled through me, a bitter taste rising in my mouth. My legs felt like brittle reeds, threatening to give out beneath me. I stumbled back, catching myself on the cold, rough stone of the wall. The room pulsed with a faint, almost imperceptible hum, a vibration that resonated not in my ears, but in the marrow of my bones. It was a low, resonant thrum of ancient, cultivated despair. For so long, I had been a victim, a puppet dancing on the strings of this house's malice, a pawn in a game I didn't understand. But now, seeing it, understanding the deliberate architecture of this horror, something shifted inside me. This wasn't just some random malevolence. This was designed, and if it was designed, it could be unmade. I was an architect. I built structures. I understood the language of stone and beam, of stress and support, of hidden spaces and deliberate flaws. My family had built this, and I would tear it down or at least understand its blueprint. I forced myself to move, my steps hesitant at first, then gaining a shaky determination. My gaze swept over the room, no longer just seeing a decrepit space, but examining it. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, every surface held a story, a purpose. I ran my fingers along a seam in the wall, feeling a subtle unevenness. It wasn't a crack. It was a joint, meticulously crafted, almost invisible. There was a faint, almost imperceptible pattern carved into the stone near the baseboard, obscured by layers of grime and age. I knelt, scraping at the dust with my fingernail. It wasn't decorative. It was a series of interlocking symbols, angular and stark, reminiscent of some ancient script I'd seen in dusty architectural texts, but never fully understood. They seemed to radiate a faint, prickling energy, like static electricity on a winter night. Each symbol was meticulously etched, not haphazardly scratched. This was a language. My great aunt, a gaunt woman with eyes like polished stones, once spoke of the cornerstone of sorrow and the house that remembers. I had dismissed it as the rambling of an old woman, a morbid fascination with the past. But what if it wasn't? What if these were not just stories but blueprints? A low groan, like wood settling under immense pressure, echoed from the far corner of the room. I froze, my head snapping up. It was a warning. I was intruding. I needed to find a clue, something concrete. The symbols, they were the key. I remembered an old, leather-bound volume I'd found in the library, tucked away behind a false panel in the study. It was filled with my ancestors' bizarre sketches and annotations, architectural drawings unlike anything I'd ever seen, interspersed with diagrams of celestial bodies and strange, geometric patterns. I had thought it was the ramblings of a madman. Now I wondered if it was a manual. My gaze fell upon a small, almost imperceptible indentation in the floor directly beneath the skeletal figure's cart. It wasn't a flaw. It was a shallow depression, perfectly circular, barely an inch deep, but its edges were unnaturally sharp, as if cut by a diamond. And within it, etched into the very stone, was a single, repeated symbol, a stark, open eye, but without a pupil. It was a symbol of observation, of eternal watching, but also of emptiness, and it was identical to one of the symbols I just uncovered on the wall. This wasn't just a place where grief collected. This was a machine for it. The symbols, the strange materials, the very layout of this room, it was all designed to amplify, to contain, to feed. My family hadn't just suffered, they had engineered their suffering, and perhaps the suffering of others. The thought was sickening, but it ignited a furious spark within me. If they could build it, I could unbuild it, or at the very least disrupt it. I stood, my muscles aching, my heart a frantic drum against my ribs. The air in the room grew heavy, thick with an unseen presence pressing in from all sides. The skeletal figure seemed to lean forward, its empty gaze fixed on me, though I knew it had no eyes. It was watching, judging, waiting. I had found a thread, a potential weakness in the tapestry of its power. But what would happen if I pulled it? It wasn't a corpse. It was a vessel, a receptacle, a thing fastened. A thing fastened to what, exactly? I didn't know. The silence in this forgotten room, deep within the ancestral home's decaying foundations, felt heavier than the dust motes dancing in the beam of my struggling flashlight. The air itself tasted like ancient rust and something else. Something that prickled the back of my throat with the metallic tang of dried blood. My heart hammered against my ribs, not from panic, not yet, but from a desperate, frantic need to understand. My family, my guilt, this house, they were all connected. I knew it in my gut, a sickening certainty that had driven me down into this forgotten space, away from the relative safety of the floors above. I had to know what this thing was, what it wanted, what it had done. The skeletal figure lay perfectly still, shrouded in a thin, decaying sheet that seemed to cling to its contours like a second skin. Every rib, every joint, every knob of bone was etched in stark relief. It was too tall, too gaunt, too wrong to be human, yet the shape was undeniably human. A twisted mockery, a husk, a faint sound, a rustle like dry leaves skittering across a stone floor broke the suffocating quiet. I flinched, my flashlight beam jumping wildly, catching on cobweb-draped corners and medical instruments that looked like relics from another age. My breath hitched again, caught in my throat. Nothing. My muscles screamed with tension, every fiber coiled and ready to spring. I could feel my own grief, a dull, constant ache in my chest, thrumming, vibrating, as if drawn to this place. There was this what the entity fed on, there was this. He was gaunt, his skin like parchment stretched over sharp angles, his eyes sunken and too wide, reflecting my flashlight with an unnatural glint. His clothes were tattered, ancient, clinging to him like the sheet on the cart. He was the attendant, I realized with a sickening jolt, the one who had occasionally appeared in the periphery of my visions, always watching, always fading. He looked like he had been there for centuries, an extension of the decay around us. He was another vessel, I thought, but one still holding a flicker of something human, something that could speak. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice thin, reedy, barely my own, the one who watches the collection. His gaze flickered to the skeletal figure on the cart, then back to me, an unnerving blend of fear and a strange, profound resignation. "Collection?" I managed, my tongue thick. My mouth was bone dry. "It feeds on the sorrow, the guilt, the regret. It gathers it, draws it in." He raised a trembling, skeletal hand, pointing a finger, yellowed and long, at the figure on the cart. That one was its first, the family's first sacrifice. Sacrifice? My family, my house. It wasn't just feeding, it was collecting, cultivating. "It keeps them," the attendant continued, his voice gaining a strange, detached cadence, as if reciting a long-forgotten litany. "The purest, the deepest, the most agonizing grief. It draws them in, these vessels, and fills them with the essence of what it consumes, a storehouse, a reserve." He pushed himself up from the chair, a slow, creaking motion like dry branches rubbing together. His movements were jerky, unnatural. He was closer now, and I could see the fine tremor that ran through his entire frame. He wasn't just old, he was drained. "You brought it more," he accused, his voice rising a fraction, a fragile reed in the vast emptiness. His eyes, fixed on mine, seemed to bore into my soul. "Your guilt, your sorrow, the perfect offering, it stirs now. It feels you here, Raj. It feels the depth of your despair." A sudden sharp crack echoed through the infirmary. I jumped, swinging the light wildly. A glass vial had fallen from a nearby shelf, shattering on the stone floor. The smell of something acrid, chemical, joined the must and rust. The attendant's eyes widened, pupils dilating until they were black pools. He began to tremble violently. A full-body shudder. "It knows," he whimpered, a sound like a trapped animal. "It knows you are here to take what is its." My gaze snapped back to the skeletal figure on the cart. Was it my imagination, or was there a faint, almost imperceptible tremor running through its ancient sheet? A shifting, a settling, as if the vessel itself was stirring from a long slumber. The attendant staggered back, pressing himself against the wall, his hands scrabbling at the rough stone. "It wants you," he rasped, his voice now a desperate, terrified plea. "It wants your grief. It wants to fill I." A low, guttural sound, like stones grinding together, emanated from the cart. It wasn't a growl, not a moan, but something far more ancient, far more terrifying. The sheet on the skeletal figure visibly tightened, pulling taut across unseen angles. My legs felt like lead, rooted to the spot. My flashlight beam danced wildly, reflecting the fear in my eyes. The sound from the cart grew louder, a deep, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor, up my legs, into my very bones. What exactly was it trying to fill, and what would happen if it succeeded? My breath hitched again, this time in pure, unadulterated terror. The sound, that grinding, ancient rasp, vibrated through the floorboards, through the very air. It felt less like a noise escaping a throat, and more like the house itself was groaning, shifting its bones. The sheet, stretched taut over the skeletal figure on the cart in the infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves, now began to ripple. Not a gentle sway, but a controlled, deliberate undulation, as if something immense was stirring beneath. A faint, sickly sweet odor, like lilies left too long in stagnant water, bloomed in the stale air. My eyes were fixed on the cart, on the form that was no longer merely inert. The sheet pulled tighter still, revealing the sharp, impossible angles of a rib cage, a hip bone, a shoulder. They seemed to sharpen, to distend, pushing against the fabric as if the figure beneath was growing or struggling to shed its shroud. My throat felt like sandpaper. I wanted to scream, to run, but my feet were cemented to the spot, my gaze snared by the horrifying tableau. Then a whisper. It wasn't a human voice, not truly. It was a dry, papery rustle, like dead leaves skittering across flagstones. Yet it formed words, my name, Raj. It sighed, drawn out and ancient, carrying the weight of centuries of despair. It wasn't a question, but an invitation, a lure. My vision blurred at the edges. My legs trembled, not just from fear, but from a profound weariness that threatened to collapse me. The guilt, always a dull throb beneath my consciousness, flared into a searing pain. The faces of my family, their smiles, their laughter, their final. Terrified screams, they flashed behind my eyes. This house, this thing, it fed on it. It had been doing so for generations, and I, with my broken spirit, was merely its latest, most potent meal. I had come to this house to escape, to forget, but it had only magnified my torment. Now it was time to end it, not just for myself, but for every other soul this malevolence had consumed. I wouldn't be its final course. I forced my gaze away from the cart, tearing my eyes from the skeletal patient. The air in the infirmary felt thick, heavy, pressing down on me. I needed to breathe. I needed to move. My hand, clammy and trembling, found the doorframe, a rough, splintered edge that grounded me. I turned, my back exposed to the horror behind me, and stumbled out of the room, not running, but walking with a grim purpose. Every creak of the old house echoed my own internal turmoil. I could feel the house itself watching me, its presence a suffocating blanket. It knew where I was going. It welcomed my descent. The wallpaper, peeling and stained, seemed to writhe in my peripheral vision, the patterns shifting into grotesque faces, fleeting glimpses of agony. The floorboards groaned beneath my weight, a mournful lament. The scent of damp earth and something metallic, like old blood, grew stronger as I approached the cellar door. Rough-hewn oak, scarred and ancient, its iron hinges rusted solid. It vibrated faintly, a low hum that resonated in my teeth. This wasn't just a door to a cellar, it was a gateway, to what I didn't fully know, but I felt it drawing me in, the way a moth is drawn to a deadly flame. I pushed. The door groaned, a long, drawn-out shriek of protest that seemed to tear at the fabric of the house. Dust motes danced in the sliver of moonlight filtering through a grimy window high above, illuminated for a brief, horrifying moment by the sudden disturbance. The descent into the cellar was a journey into the earth itself. The steps were rough-hewn stone, uneven and slick with a thin layer of grime. The air here was thick, heavy with the stench of decay, of something ancient and unliving. My own ragged breathing was deafening in my ears. The walls were rough-hewn rock, seeping moisture, covered in a slick black moss that seemed to pulse faintly. It wasn't a cellar, it was a crypt, a forgotten heart. A place where the house's malevolence had festered for centuries. My mind reeled with fragmented memories of my family, of the fire, of the architects before me. All the guilt, all the pain, it was all here waiting. The passage widened into a chamber, not vast, but impossibly deep, stretching into the gloom beyond the reach of my light. In the center, a rough stone pedestal stood, carved with symbols I didn't recognize, but which radiated an aura of profound wrongness. And on the pedestal, a single withered rose, black as pitch, its petals shriveled and dry, yet somehow still alive. This was it, the place where my family's legacy, my own guilt, and the house's insatiable hunger would finally collide. My hands were clammy, my mouth dry. I took a single, deliberate step into the chamber. The air crackled around me, heavy with anticipation. The sheet, stretched taut over the form on the bed in the infirmary at night, one patient who never leaves, began to ripple, not from a breeze, but from something pushing up from beneath. The sound that preceded it, that ancient grinding rasp, intensified, vibrating in my teeth, resonating deep in my chest. It was the sound of earth shifting, of stone grinding against stone, a noise too vast for any single throat. My breath caught, a cold knot in my throat. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to flee this suffocating room, to abandon the house and its horrors forever. But the memory of the fire, the phantom smell of smoke and burning wood, the faces of my family, they anchored me. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about severing the root of my torment, about finally putting an end to the cycle of grief and guilt this thing fed upon. I wouldn't let it claim another soul, not while I still breathed. The sheet convulsed violently. A dark, viscous stain began to spread from the center, seeping through the fabric as if something impossibly heavy and wet was pressing against it. The air grew thick, stagnant, carrying the cloying scent of damp earth and something else, something metallic and acrid like old blood. My vision blurred for a moment, the edges of the room wavering as the pressure in the air became almost physical. I gripped the heavy, antique architect's compass in my hand, its brass cool and solid against my sweating palm. It was a tool of creation, and I would use it to unmake this monstrosity. From beneath the sheet, a shape began to emerge. Not a body, not truly. It was a shifting mass, amorphous and vaguely humanoid, but wrong, distorted. Limbs seemed to stretch and retract, elongating into impossible proportions before snapping back. The grinding sound now accompanied a wet, sucking noise, like something pulling itself free from thick mud. I could hear the faint, shallow breathing of the patient under the sheet, fragile counterpoint to the monstrous emergence. They were still alive, still there, a thin thread of life holding this horror in place. My architectural plans, etched into my memory, flashed before my eyes, the hidden conduits, the forgotten ventilation shafts, the very foundation stones imbued with my ancestors' strange rituals. This house wasn't merely old, it was a carefully constructed cage, or perhaps a deliberately designed trap. I had studied every beam, every brick, every secret passage. I understood the flow of its energy, the way it had been intended to contain or to unleash. The infirmary, I now realized, was not just a room for the sick. It was a focal point, a nexus deliberately positioned at the intersection of several ley lines my ancestors had purportedly charted, a place where the veil between worlds thinned. And the patient was the anchor. The sheet finally tore with a wet shred. What emerged was not fully visible, shrouded in its own self-generated gloom, but I saw enough. It reached out, not for me, but towards the wall, its touch leaving a trail of decay on the plaster. The grinding sound resolved into a guttural moan, a sound of profound hunger and ancient sorrow, a symphony of all the grief it had ever consumed. It was feeding, even now, on the very air, on the despair that clung to this room. I knew what I had to do. The house was designed to contain. My ancestors, in their morbid fascination or desperate attempt at control, had built this place with a specific purpose. There was a mechanism, a structural element, intended to seal this horror away. I had found it in the old blueprints, disguised as a mundane support beam, but its placement was too precise, its material too specific. It was a linchpin. You feed on despair, I rasped, my voice shaking but firm. You feed on what I built, on what my family left behind. But I understand this house. I understand its bones. The creature paused, its amorphous form seeming to coalesce slightly, turning its unseen gaze towards me. It was listening. It was recognizing the architect in me, the one who understood its prison. I moved then, not towards the creature, but towards the intricate, carved wooden panel I had discovered hidden behind a loose floorboard in the corner. It wasn't just decorative. It was a release mechanism, a structural trigger. My hands flew over the aged wood, tracing the strange, almost alien symbols carved into its surface. These weren't mere decorations, they were glyphs, ancient seals. My ancestors hadn't just built a house, they had built a ritual cage. As my fingers pressed against a specific sequence of symbols, the room began to hum. A low, resonant vibration started in the floor, rising through my feet, up my legs. The creature on the bed shrieked, a sound that ripped through the very fabric of my being, raw and full of ancient fury. It recoiled, pulling back from the wall, its form shrinking, compacting, as if trying to pull itself back into the sheet. It understood what I was doing. It understood the trap. The patient on the bed stirred, a faint whimper escaping their lips. The creature's focus shifted to them, a desperate, frantic energy emanating from its form. It was trying to reassert its hold, to anchor itself to its source of sustenance, its tether to this world. I had to act faster. I slammed my palm against the final glyph. A deep thump reverberated through the house, originating from somewhere deep beneath the foundation. The walls of the infirmary groaned, the floorboards vibrating violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. A faint, almost imperceptible tremor shook the entire structure. The air crackled, the metallic scent intensifying, burning my nostrils. It was screaming now, a sound that wasn't just noise but a direct assault on my mind, filling it with images of the fire, of my family's last moments, of every failure and regret I'd ever harbored. It was trying to break me to feed on my unraveling. Containment. That was the purpose. Not destruction, not banishment, but containment. My ancestors hadn't been powerful enough to destroy it, but they had learned to cage it. And I, their descendant, the architect who understood the language of their stones, would reinforce that cage. The humming intensified, becoming a low drone. The patient's whimpers subsided, replaced by a deep, peaceful sleep. It was being pulled, drawn back into the bed, into the very core of the infirmary. The sheet, still torn, began to mend itself, slowly, impassibly, stitching back together as if time were reversing. With a final, desperate, soundless shriek that resonated only in my skull, the last vestige of the creature pulled itself under the sheet. The fabric settled, smooth and undisturbed, as if nothing had ever been there. The air cleared, losing its heavy, suffocating quality. The metallic tang dissipated. Silence descended, profound and absolute, broken only by my own ragged breathing and the faint, steady pulse of the house, a low thrumming that was now more comforting than terrifying. I stood there, trembling, my knees threatening to buckle. My hands were slick with sweat, my heart racing. Had it worked? Had I truly sealed it away, or merely bought myself a moment of peace before it found another way out, another crack in the foundation of my fragile resolve? The house, now quiet, seemed to hold its breath, waiting. I moved then, not towards the creature, but towards the great central column, the one I'd often studied on the blueprints, the one I knew was the house's beating heart. It was a structural linchpin, a massive stone cylinder disguised as an ornate pillar, extending from the deepest foundation to the highest attic. The entity's amorphous mass pulsed, a dark, churning cloud of grief and memory, its unseen gaze pinning me in place. The grinding had stopped, leaving a silence that pressed in on my ears, thick and suffocating, like a damp shroud. It recognized the architect in me, the one who understood its prison, and now its vulnerability. My lungs burned, each breath a shallow gasp of air heavy with the scent of damp earth and something acrid like burnt sugar. My hands, still stinging from the debris of the earlier attacks, sought purchase on the rough-hewn stone of the pillar. I wasn't trying to destroy the creature, not directly. I was going for its tether, the anchor point that bound it to this place, to my family's legacy. The house itself was the cage, and I, the architect, knew how to spring the lock. With a desperate surge of adrenaline, I launched myself at a section of the pillar, a specific point I'd noticed during my initial inspections, a hairline fracture hidden beneath layers of grime and ancient plaster. It wasn't a flaw in my design. It was a flaw in the original construction, a weakness I'd noted in my mental catalog of the ancestral home's structural quirks. I hammered at it with a loose piece of timber I'd snatched from the floor, a jagged, splintered beam that felt impossibly heavy in my trembling grip. The entity shrieked then, a sound that wasn't a sound, but a tearing sensation in my very core, a rending of unseen fabric. The house bucked, groaning like a tortured beast. Dust rained down in choking clouds, mingling with fine plaster and something that felt like grit, like bone dust. Floorboards beneath my feet split with explosive cracks. Glass in the distant windows shattered, sending glittering shards skittering across the flagstones. I swung again, the timber connecting with the pillar with a dull, resonant thud. A deeper crack spiderwebbed across the stone. It whipped past my face, leaving a trail of frigid air that raised gooseflesh on my neck. I felt a stinging pain on my cheek, a thin line of warmth blossoming across my skin. I didn't flinch. I couldn't. This was it. Another blow. The pillar groaned, a low, guttural sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth. The entire house shuddered, a violent tremor that sent me stumbling. I braced myself, my shoulder slamming against the stone, the impact jarring my teeth. The entity recoiled, its form twisting, shrinking as if in agony. It was losing its hold. The link was weakening. My architectural eye, honed by years of studying stress points and load distribution, had found its mark. One final, desperate swing. The timber splintered in my hands, but not before it delivered a shattering blow. The entity let out a final, ear-splitting shriek, a sound that seemed to tear the very fabric of the house. The house stopped shaking. The dust slowly settled, revealing a landscape of ruin. I stood amidst the wreckage, my body trembling uncontrollably, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My arm throbbed, a dull ache blooming into sharp spikes of pain. I felt a sticky warmth trickling down my temple, mingling with the sweat and dust. I had survived, but the house was irrevocably scarred, a wound that would never fully heal. And I, too, was changed, my soul scorched by the sheer, unadulterated malevolence I had faced. I stumbled away from the ravaged pillar, my legs threatening to give out beneath me. I needed to escape the main hall, to find some semblance of quiet, to tend to the throbbing pain in my arm and the deeper ache in my chest. I pushed through a splintered door, one I didn't recall ever noticing before, tucked away behind a collapsed section of wall. It led down a short, narrow passage, eerily untouched by the recent violence. The passage opened into a room I had never seen in any of the blueprints, a space that felt strangely preserved, like a forgotten tomb. The air here was cooler, cleaner, smelling faintly of dried herbs and antiseptic, though the scent was ancient, almost entirely faded. Moonlight, stark and unforgiving, spilled through a high, grimy window, illuminating a single, narrow cot in the center of the room. This was an infirmary at night, a place designed for healing, yet utterly devoid of warmth. And on the cot, perfectly still, lay a figure. It was shrouded in a thin, tattered sheet, but the outline of a human form was unmistakable. The head was turned towards the moonlight, revealing a face gaunt, pallid, etched with lines of age and suffering. The eyes were open, wide and unblinking, staring blankly at the ceiling, or perhaps through it, into something only they could see. The hair, a shock of brittle white, fanned out on the pillow. The patient never moved, never stirred. A thin, bony hand rested on the sheet, the fingers curled slightly, as if still grasping for something long lost. Who was this person, left behind in this forgotten room, tethered to the house in a way I couldn't yet comprehend? And why did their empty gaze feel like a silent accusation? It was a structural linchpin, a massive stone cylinder disguised as an ornate pillar, extending from the deepest foundation to the roof, a dark artery. The air around it hummed, not with electricity, but with a palpable pressure, a suffocating weight of ancient sorrow. I could see the faint, shimmering tendrils of the entity withdrawing, recoiling from my purpose, pulling back into the stone itself. It knew what I intended. My hands, still trembling from the cold dread that had become my constant companion, reached out, not to destroy, but to feel the cold, rough surface. It pulsed with a low, deep thrum like a forgotten drum, my family's legacy. My ancestors hadn't built a house, they'd built a cage, a well, a battery. The entity wasn't just in the house, it was the house, or at least this pillar was its spine, its central nervous system. But I couldn't leave it to fester. I needed to cut off its sustenance, to starve it. My fingers traced the faint, almost invisible carvings on the stone. Symbols I now recognized from the old family texts, words meant to contain, not to empower. They had been twisted, inverted, corrupted. The entity had turned their protection into its prison. With a deep breath that tasted of dust and despair, I began to reverse them, pushing my own will, my own newfound resolve, against the ancient, ingrained malice. What would happen if I succeeded? Would the house simply die, or would it finally be free? The house shuddered. A low groan rumbled through the floorboards, shaking the dust from the rafters. The air grew heavy, thick with a smell like ozone and damp earth, as if the very foundations were crying out. I felt a sharp, burning pain in my hands, as if the stone itself was resisting, searing my skin. My own grief, my guilt over the fire, tried to resurface, to overwhelm me, to feed the beast one last time. But I pushed back, picturing my wife's smile, my children's laughter, not in sorrow, but as a shield, a defiant memory of love. This was not for them to feed on. This was for me, for my peace. I focused, pushing the ancient symbols back into their original configuration, feeling the resistance lessen, then shatter. A soft thump reverberated through the column, like a heart skipping a beat, then resuming a slower, weaker rhythm. The air, though still cool, no longer carried the metallic tang of fear. My hands, though aching, felt clean. I slumped against the pillar, exhausted, every muscle screaming in protest. The house, too, seemed to sigh, settling into itself, no longer a predatory beast, but an old, tired structure. I wandered through the empty rooms, the dust motes dancing in the weak morning light that filtered through the grimy windows. The house felt empty, not abandoned, but cleared. The presence was gone. I felt a fragile sense of calm, a peace that had been alien to me for so long. But the house still held secrets. I knew it. There was one room, tucked away in the deepest part of the foundation, an area I'd only ever seen on the oldest, most cryptic blueprints. A place marked simply, infirmary. I'd always dismissed it as an archaic label, a forgotten sick room. But now, after what I'd learned, I felt compelled to find it. What would such a place hold after all these years? The door to the infirmary was not locked, merely stuck, swollen with age and disuse. It opened with a groan that echoed eerily in the confined space. The air inside was still, heavy with the scent of dust and something else, something cloying and sweet, like dried flowers and stale breath. It was a small room, windowless, lit by a single bare bulb hanging from a frayed wire. In the center, on a simple cot, lay a figure. It was skeletal, draped in a thin, gray blanket, its skin like parchment stretched over bone. Its eyes, ancient and milky, stared blankly at the ceiling. The hair was a thin, white halo. This was the one patient who never leaves. Not a patient in any modern sense, but a prisoner, a relic. This was the original architect, the progenitor of my line, the one who had first twisted the wards, who had made the pact. The entity hadn't just fed on grief. It had created it, cultivated it, and this shell was the proof, kept alive, sustained by the very force it had unleashed. The ultimate irony. What did it mean to be alive? Yet utterly consumed, I stood there for a long time, watching the slow, almost imperceptible rise and fall of the blanket. The patient didn't stir, didn't acknowledge my presence. It was a monument to a terrible choice, a living, breathing testament to the depths of my family's depravity. I knew then that I couldn't simply walk away. I couldn't leave this shell to linger, nor could I allow the house to ever again become a feeding ground. The house was dormant, but not cleansed. I understood now that my role was not just to survive, but to truly sever the ties, to break the cycle. The house, for all its horrors, was still a part of me, a part of my family's story. I had to decide what kind of story it would tell next. Would I tear it down, erasing the evidence, or would I try to redeem it, to make amends for the sins of the past? My hands, still tingling from the pillar, felt heavy with the weight of that choice. What did true redemption look like for a house built on such a foundation? I stayed in the house for weeks, not as its victim, but as its caretaker. I began to repair, to clean, to fill the rooms with fresh air and sunlight. The house no longer felt like a tomb nor a moor. It was just an old house, scarred but quiet. My grief for my own family had not vanished, but it had transformed. It was no longer a raw wound, but a memory, cherished and sad, but no longer a weapon wielded against me. I found myself sketching again, not grand designs, but small, practical repairs, ways to let light in, to secure the crumbling walls. I had nowhere else to go. This house was my penance, my burden, and perhaps my unlikely sanctuary. But for now, the silence was enough. What would become of this house, and of me, in the long, quiet years ahead?